Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer. We're looking at the history, the creation, and yeah, the incredibly complicated legacy of Gone with the Wind. Whether you've actually tackled that giant 1,000-page book, sat through the 4-hour movie, or just know the iconic line, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn," this story is literally everywhere in our culture. But right beneath that sweeping Southern romance, well, there's a wild true story about a totally reluctant author, a historical backdrop that is meticulously researched but very selective, and a legacy that, honestly, still sparks huge debates today.
So here's how we're going to break this down today. First, the rebel author. Then, writing the phenomenon. Next up, fact-checking the war. Fourth, we'll look at the lost cause reality. And finally, a polarizing legacy.
All right, starting with part 1, the rebel author, tragedies, and triumphs. Let's move to the timeline and see how this builds, because honestly, before Margaret Mitchell ever even picked up a pen, her own life was packed with enough drama for a novel. Born into a prominent Atlanta family in 1900, she was literally surrounded by folks who'd lived through the Civil War and Reconstruction. But tragedy hit her really early. In 1918, her fiancé was killed fighting over in France during World War I, and then just months later, her mom died in the massive influenza epidemic. So a young Margaret has to drop out of Smith College, head home, and run the house. But you guys, she was not the quiet, mourning type. She was this rebellious debutante who totally scandalized Atlanta high society by doing these sultry Parisian nightclub dances at charity balls. She actually married a guy named Red Upshaw first. He was this charming but super unreliable bootlegger, and everybody basically agrees he was the real-life model for Rhett Butler. That marriage fizzled out fast. She eventually settled down with an editor named John Marsh, and then, man, her life ended just as dramatically as it began. She was tragically struck and killed by a speeding taxi in Atlanta in 1949. Moving right along to Section 2, writing the phenomenon as secret masterpiece. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that it took a literal broken ankle in 1926 to finally slow this woman down long enough to write. She had to quit her journalism job, and to keep her from going crazy with boredom, her husband brought home a Remington typewriter, set it up right on an old sewing table. And get this, she wrote the very last chapter of the book first, then she just kind of bounced around, writing chapters totally out of order and stuffing them into manila envelopes. And she kept the whole thing completely secret. If friends dropped by, she'd literally throw a bath towel over the typewriter to hide the messy stacks of paper. For years, nobody knew. Oh, and here's a wild fact. Her famous, fiercely stubborn main character, originally named Pansy. Yep. Not Scarlet. It wasn't until 1935, when a Macmillan editor named Harold Latham was scouting in the South, that a friend basically teased Mitchell into finally dragging this massive stack of envelopes to him in his hotel lobby. So the publisher buys the book, but Mitchell still has to actually finish the thing, and she really struggled with the title. Just imagine reading a classic called Tomorrow is Another Day, or Not in Our Stars, or Bugles Sing True. Obviously, she eventually changed Pansy to Scarlet O'Hara, good call there, and pulled the final title from a line in one of her favorite poems, Gone with the Wind. And for handing over this absolute beast of a manuscript, Mitchell got an advance of just $500. To put that into perspective, the publisher printed a massive 1,037-page brick of a book, and they originally sold it for just $3 a pop. But boy, did that $500 pay off. The book hit the market like an absolute literary earthquake. It has sold well over 28 million copies to date, snagged the Pulitzer Prize in 1937, and obviously became the 1939 cinematic event that basically rewrote Hollywood box office history. Mitchell went from a secretive writer to an overnight, totally reluctant global celebrity. Which brings us to Section 3, fact-checking the war, accuracy versus myth. See, Mitchell was absolutely terrified that living Civil War veterans were going to call her out on historical errors. She famously bragged that she could pull up 4 different historical sources for every single line of nonfiction in the text. So, how'd she actually do? Well, looking purely at the military timeline, she nailed it. The story kicks off exactly when Abraham Lincoln calls for volunteers in April 1861, and Mitchell perfectly captures how the war slowly creeps into Scarlet's little bubble of parties and gossip. From the absolute shockwaves of the Gettysburg casualties in July 1863, right down to the desperate burning fall of Atlanta in September 1864, the hard dates framing Scarlet's world are rock solid. And this brilliantly illustrates how she wove the real-world economics into the narrative, too. Looking at this breakdown, the northern advantages are just staggering. 5 times the factories, double the railroads holding 96% of the country's train equipment and 81% of the U.S. bank deposits. There was this financier at the time, Baron Rothschild, who predicted that the side with the larger purse was bound to win. He hit the nail on the head. Mitchell actually doesn't shy away from this harsh reality at all. She builds it directly into the DNA of her characters. The text also gets incredibly real about the sheer devastation of Union General Sherman's march to the sea. Sherman's army literally carved a 60-mile-wide strip of burned-out, looted land straight through the state of Georgia. Mitchell's vivid descriptions of a starving, desperate South and these hollowed-out plantations, that's a very accurate reflection of the total war strategy used to completely break the Confederacy. You can actually see this whole historical clash perfectly embodied by the two main guys in Scarlet's life. You've got Rhett Butler, right? He's the voice of cold, hard, historical realism. He literally stands there at a barbecue warning all these arrogant Southern gentlemen about northern foundries and naval blockades, basically predicting the economic crash. And then acting as his total opposite is Ashley Wilkes. Ashley is pure, unfiltered romanticism. He even admits he's not fighting for any kind of military glory. He's fighting for the moonlit beauty, the cotton fields, and the quote-unquote old ways. It's a completely poetic and entirely doomed fight. All right, so let's look at Section 4, The Lost Cause, Reality, Revisionist History. Now, while Mitchell clearly got the dates and the bank accounts right, to really understand this explainer impartially, we have to step back and objectively look at the ideological framework of the novel itself. We need to look closely at what the text actually says. Mitchell's worldview was heavily influenced by historians from the 1920s and 30s who actively promoted something called the lost cause. As you can see defined here, this is an ideology that deeply romanticizes the pre-war South. It portrays the Confederate cause as this purely noble crusade, and it deliberately minimizes or completely erases the brutal, inhuman realities of slavery. And objectively speaking, when you read the source material, Gone with the Wind is packed with elements that directly align with that revisionist history. The omniscient narrator in the book routinely describes enslaved people as childlike or heavily dependent or, quote, happy to serve, completely erasing the actual horrors of chattel slavery. On top of that, when you get to the Reconstruction chapters, the text actively glorifies the Ku Klux Klan. It portrays them as these necessary protectors of Southern women while totally demonizing Northern influences like the Freedmen's Bureau. Ultimately, the book presents a deeply racialized and fundamentally warped view of the post-war South, which directly reflects the segregated society that Mitchell herself was living and writing in. Which leads us to our final part. Section 5, A Polarizing Legacy, The Modern Dissonance. So the absolutely crucial point we need to address is, how exactly does a modern reader grapple with a book that is simultaneously a masterclass in character survival and a literal vessel for racist propaganda? Well, if you look at modern reviews, there is a massive, profound split. On one hand, people still fiercely connect with Scarlet O'Hara. Take a look at this Goodreads review. They call her a towering anti-heroine, amoral, selfish, and brave. Back when female characters were basically required to be perfectly virtuous, Scarlet was a total game changer. She's a survivor who will use literally every manipulative trick in the book to save her land and herself, and readers genuinely still love reading about that unapologetic drive. But then, immediately contrast that praise with this one-star review from the exact same platform. Modern readers express a visceral and frankly, completely justified anger at the book's foundational racism. As this reviewer points out, to engage with this novel means you have to spend 1,000 pages with a narrator who repeatedly disparages Black people and romanticizes their enslavement. For a lot of readers today, that hateful propaganda makes the entire book fundamentally broken and entirely unreadable. So that brings us to the end of our explainer, and to a really heavy question, one that literature lovers, historians, and everyday readers alike have to keep asking themselves. How do we engage with a beloved cultural classic that is built on such a hateful foundation? Do we just read it as a flawed masterpiece? Do we discard it entirely? Or do we study it as this highly complicated, uncomfortable artifact of American history? It's a dissonance that guarantees Gone with the Wind is going to be fiercely debated for a very long time. Thanks so much for hanging out and learning with me today, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.